Before Jesus began his public ministry, he lived a quiet and unassuming life in Nazareth, working as a carpenter alongside his earthly father, Joseph. Known for his kindness, wisdom, and skill, Jesus' reputation as a craftsman extended far beyond the borders of his small village. People often spoke of how the objects he created seemed to carry an inexplicable sense of peace and purpose. Though many came to him for practical work, a sturdy chair, a reliable yoke for oxen, or a repaired table, there were also those who found themselves drawn to him for reasons they couldn't quite explain. They would leave his shop with more than just the work they'd requested. They would leave with a renewed sense of hope and direction. It was during this time, in the years before his ministry began, that Jesus' hands, so skilled at shaping wood, also began to shape lives. One warm spring morning, as the village of Nazareth hummed with life, a widow named Miriam walked hesitantly toward Jesus' workshop. Her thin frame and worn clothing bore silent testimony to her struggles. She had been living a life of quiet desperation, doing her best to care for her 2 young children after her husband's untimely death. Miriam's only source of income was her weaving. Using an old loom her husband had built years ago, she made simple cloth to sell at the market. But the loom had recently broken, leaving her unable to work. She had no money to buy a new one, and with each passing day, the weight of her situation grew heavier. When she entered Jesus' workshop, she found him seated at a workbench, carefully sanding a piece of wood. The room smelled of fresh sawdust and oil, and the morning light streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the scene. Jesus looked up and smiled. "Peace be with you, Miriam," he said, his voice gentle and welcoming. "How can I help you today?" Miriam hesitated, clutching the broken loom in her hands. "Master," she said, her voice trembling, I have nothing to pay you with, but I need your help. This loom is all I have to provide for my children. Without it, I cannot work." Jesus rose from his seat and approached her. He took the broken loom from her hands, examining it with care. His eyes, filled with compassion, met hers. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Leave this with me, and I will make it as good as new." As Miriam left the workshop, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't experienced in months. Jesus set to work immediately, handling the broken loom as if it were a treasure. His hands moved with precision, not only repairing the damage, but also reinforcing its structure to make it stronger. As he worked, a few villagers stopped by to watch. "Why spend so much time on something so old?" one man asked. "It would be easier to build a new one." Jesus smiled but didn't stop working. "This loom has served faithfully for years," he replied. "It's worth saving." By the time he was finished, the loom looked not only functional, but also beautiful. Jesus had carved delicate flowers into the frame, a touch of artistry that transformed the simple tool into something extraordinary. When Miriam returned to collect the loom, she gasped in astonishment. It was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Tears filled her eyes as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood and the intricate carvings. "Master, I cannot thank you enough," she said. "How did you do this?" Jesus smiled. "It wasn't just the wood that needed repairing, Miriam. Sometimes what we create with our hands can remind us of the beauty and strength within ourselves." Miriam left the workshop with her loom and a renewed sense of hope. She immediately began weaving again, creating cloth that was more vibrant and skillfully made than before. Word of her work spread quickly, and soon people from neighboring villages came to buy her fabrics. What Miriam didn't know was that Jesus had quietly encouraged others to support her. When people asked him where to find high-quality fabric, he always directed them to Miriam. Though she never discovered his role in her success, she often found herself marveling at how her once broken life had been transformed. A few months later, another man came to Jesus with a different kind of problem. Ezra, a farmer known for his hard work, had recently suffered a terrible loss. A storm had destroyed much of his crop, and he was left with little to sustain his family through the season. "I don't know what to do," Ezra confessed, sitting on a stool in Jesus' workshop. "I've worked these fields my whole life, but now it feels like all my effort was for nothing." Jesus listened carefully, his hands still, as he gave Ezra his full attention. "What can I do to help?" he asked. Ezra hesitated. "I've heard you make strong yokes for oxen. If I could plow the fields faster, maybe I could salvage what's left." Jesus nodded. "I'll make you the strongest yoke you've ever seen," he said. "But there's something more important you need to understand." "What's that?" Ezra asked. "You are not defined by this loss," Jesus replied. "Your worth is not in your crops or your success. It's in who you are, a child of God. Trust that even in this hardship, something good will come." Jesus worked late into the evening, crafting the yoke with care. When he finished, he delivered it to Ezra personally. The farmer, moved by Jesus' words and generosity, began to see his situation differently. Though the road ahead was still difficult, he found strength in trusting that God was with him. Years passed and Jesus continued to touch lives through his work. Whether it was a chair for an elderly woman, a repaired table for a struggling family, or words of encouragement for someone in despair, his workshop became a place of transformation. But Jesus knew his time as a carpenter was coming to an end. The day would soon arrive when he would leave Nazareth and begin his ministry, a calling that would change the world. One evening, as he stood outside his workshop, looking at the stars, he prayed, "Father, thank you for these years of preparation. I have seen your hand at work in the lives of those I've served. As I step into this next chapter, may I continue to bring your love and hope to those who need it most." Long after Jesus left Nazareth, the stories of his time as a carpenter continued to be told. People spoke of the widow whose loom had been transformed, the farmer who had found strength in the midst of loss, and countless others whose lives had been touched by his hands. Though his ministry would become known for miracles and teachings, those who had known him in Nazareth always remembered the quiet carpenter who had shown them the love of God through simple acts of kindness.
And in the years that followed, whenever someone faced a challenge, they would often find themselves saying, "If the carpenter could see the beauty in what was broken, perhaps there is hope for me too."